What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and Wyrd just this week put out 2 new updates for the other side. Now, this is a big relief because this game has not gotten a lot of love in the past couple of years. In fact, we haven't gotten any kind of errata or update to the competitive operations in several years at this point. A lot of people already know that this game got off to a pretty rocky start because of Kickstarter and COVID and all these different things, but it's a really cool game, so I'm glad to see that Wyrd is giving it a little bit of love. And I'm hoping that this is going to be the beginning of a big push to get TOS out there in a much bigger way than it has up until this point. If you've been keeping up, then you probably know that they put out the 2-player starter set a couple of years back, which apparently was a big hit. And then we recently got the Beyond the Other Side expansion book that introduces the Common and the Three Kingdoms, 2 new factions to the game. I'm really excited about those 2 factions, and the stories in that book were really good, so you should definitely check it out if you haven't had a chance to yet. But unfortunately, while we saw a couple of things released for the Common, we haven't seen anything for the Three Kingdoms yet, and there's nothing on the release calendar for the next couple of months at least. Now, I know that's something that had a lot of people a little bit worried, myself included, but it's certainly possible that this is just an issue with logistics. Obviously, everybody's been having a lot of problems with getting stuff shipped over from overseas. Or maybe Wyrd is just holding that stuff back so that they can do a bigger push for the game at some point when they have a bunch of stuff to announce. But either way, the fact that they were putting the development time into putting out these 2 new documents is exciting, and I think it bodes well for the game overall. Plus, we got a little bit of a tease for a new faction that's supposed to be coming up that was also announced a long time ago. But we'll talk about that in a minute. First, I just wanted to touch on a couple of the balance changes that they made, and this is something that I think has been a long time coming. It's been needed for a long time. If you've been actively playing TOS, then you know that Abyssinia was a bit of a problem. And it hurts me to say that because they're my favorite faction, but we got a couple of changes to sort of tone down some of the really broken stuff that they were able to do. I think the most important one was for the mechanized infantry, which had this ability to take a bunch of shots, and every time they shot at the same target, they would get more accurate, and it was pretty much a really broken combo. That was arguably the strongest unit in the entire game. So they got a little bit of a cost increase, they got a couple of their stats reduced, and the ability that makes them more accurate as they go is only going to apply if they miss those shots, which I think makes a little bit of sense. It's like concentrating your fire and trying to guarantee that you get at least one hit in without it just being this super broken combo where you can just put relentless fire into one target and just take them down. Another major change to Abyssinia is the way that they do their card draw. So they were obviously known for getting a ton of card draw. They have a built-in trigger on every one of their duels where they can draw a card if they have tomes in the duel. And that's been changed so that now, instead of just drawing a card every time you get that trigger, you're going to be able to draw a card out of your discard pile, and it has to be a 5 or less. And the idea here is that you're going to have a lot of cheap cards that are available to be discarded to use your prototype assets, which synergizes well with the overall playstyle that the faction is sort of going for. But it's definitely going to be a lot less powerful because you're not going to have those high cards in your hand all the time to be able to cheat. So that's a pretty big difference, but in addition to that, you're also going to be able to take the 1s out of your deck. Every time the 4 1s would be shuffled into your deck, you're actually going to take them out and put them in your discard pile. So not only does that mean you're not going to be flipping 1s, but it also means that you'll have those 1s available to draw to be used later as discard fodder. That's kind of a cool thing, and it kind of plays into this idea that Abyssinia are these really elite sort of high-tech units that are very powerful, so they don't flip 1s like the other plebes out there. This seems like a pretty big change. I am used to playing that game with a lot of cards in my hand because we always get card draw from that trigger, but this is going to change things pretty significantly. I'm not sure if this is too much of a swing in the other direction where you're not going to have enough card draw available, but I do think it was something that needed to be toned down, so we're going to have to wait and see how this actually plays out. On top of that, the Engineer, which is the adjunct for Abyssinia, is no longer going to draw a card every activation. It is going to draw a card when the Engineer is actually killed. So this will probably be a little bit less consistent, but it does mean if that fire team is taking a lot of damage, then you can actually potentially get more card draw out of it if you're losing the Engineer and then reinforcing it back in. I think I kind of prefer to just have the consistent card draw, but again, the faction overall just had way too much card draw, so I think a lot of this needed to be changed. And then the last thing is that the stratagem, the Lion Among the Gazelles, which allows you to activate a commander twice in the same turn, is going to be limited to once per game instead of going back into your deck to be bought again. And this is probably a necessary change. I used to double activate the Lord of Steel pretty much every turn, and that's probably a little bit too abusive. So I think once per game is definitely more fair. Now, no other allegiances in the game got any changes with the exception of the King's Empire, which got a little bit of a buff because they were kind of struggling to stay competitive. Now, I actually have a King's Empire army, but I haven't had a chance to play them yet because I pretty much always play Abyssinia. So I'm not quite as familiar with the way that they used to play, but one of the major changes here is that you used to have to kill a fire team in order to flip to glory. And depending on who you were matched against, that could be kind of a struggle. It's a little bit tricky to pull that off in any kind of consistent manner. And when you're going against armies that have very consistent ways to flip to glory, I always felt like that was a little bit of a weird choice. So the change that they made is now all you have to do is win an opposed duel against your enemy and discard an inspired token to flip to glory. And I think that works a lot better because it still has the same feel of you sort of being aggressive and dominating your opponent to flip to glory, but you don't actually have to wipe a fire team off the table in order to do so. On top of that, the inspired tokens are actually going to get spent for a +3 instead of a +2 on your models, which I think is pretty cool because it sort of plays into this idea that they are really focused on these inspired tokens. And their ability that allows them to use their guns in melee no longer applies that -2 modifier to their accuracy. This makes it play a little bit more like Gunfighter does in Malifaux, which I think is fair because the King's Empire is obviously focused on their range attacks with their guns, and once they got in melee, they didn't really have much to do except for attack at a much lower acting value. So this should help them out a lot more when stuff gets in their face. Now, the change that I think I am maybe the most excited about is a change to the way that hazardous terrain is going to work. Now, the article that Wyrd posted talks about how a unit can be completely wiped out by a couple of hazardous terrain flips, and that was kind of a feel-bad thing in the game, and I have definitely had that experience where a very expensive unit just gets abused by the Storm Siren, pushed into tide pools twice, and wipes out an entire unit because of some unlucky flips. Because the way that it used to work is if you were affected by hazardous terrain, your opponent would flip a card, apply it to the strength, and it would just go right against your armor. It basically bypassed any kind of accuracy requirement and just went straight to the damage step. And there was also no way for the defender to interact with that. They would just flip the card and it would apply damage or it wouldn't. So the way that it's going to work now is when you're taking hazardous damage, you're going to flip the card. And this gives you the opportunity to cheat in case there's a situation where it's a super important model and you want to make sure that it doesn't get wiped out. You have that opportunity to sort of save them with your control hand. I think generally any mechanic that you don't have a chance to interact with or defend against is kind of a bad thing. It definitely feels bad when your opponent is just doing this to you and you have no way to stop them or do anything about it. And it really disincentivized risking it and going over hazardous terrain when you knew that there was just a chance you were going to take some damage to the face and there was nothing you could do about it. But now you're going to have this opportunity to make some important choices where you have to decide if you want to use your control hand to try to avoid it or if you want to save those cards and risk taking the damage. More decision points, I think, is always better, and I think this is going to mean that we're not going to see so many of those instances where something like the Storm Siren goes in and completely dumpsters a really expensive unit in one activation, and there's not much you can do about it. And the last fun thing here is that we see on the list of changes to the different allegiances, with the kind of no changes listed out for every other allegiance except for Abyssinia and King's Empire, we also see another allegiance that is crossed out, but you can clearly see that it used to say Sandmen. Now, if you're not familiar, the Sandmen were promised to be the next allegiance added to the game, and if I remember correctly, they are going to be an allegiance that is universal and can work for Malifaux side or Earth side. This was the result of a worldwide event that went on years ago where we were deciding between the Council, the Order of Chimera, and the Sandmen actually won that contest, so they're going to be the new faction added to the game. So the Sandmen are connected to Nightmare or Lord Chompy Bits. He was in the Dreaming Realm and actually made contact with one of the Gibbering Hordes and sort of felt the influence of Meridian, which is another tyrant, among the ranks of the Gibbering Hordes. Now, this is going to be really interesting because it seems like Meridian is poised to be potentially the next big bad in the Malifaux story because she's potentially going to be waking up and coming out from the sea and doing all sorts of fishy monster bad things. So it'll be interesting to see how the Sandmen interact with that, and it'll also be interesting to see how they work with all the other factions, because it almost seems like they shouldn't be working with any factions. Lord Chompy Bits is kind of out for his own power and doesn't typically work with anyone except the Dreamer. But we do get a little hint here that he's going to be trying to exert his will on people Earthside and sort of manifesting their nightmares into reality. So it'll be interesting to see where all that goes. I'm really glad to see that they still seem to be planning on putting out the Sandmen because it's been kind of quiet on that front for a really long time and we still haven't had even the Three Kingdoms start releasing yet. So this is probably a little ways out at this point still, but hopefully we're going to be getting some more news on that sometime in the near future. And then the last thing here is that we got a new Fields of Glory, which is the sort of competitive operations that they put out semi-regularly, similar to Gaining Grounds in Malifaux. So we get 4 new operations here, and each one of them is still going to include scoring 2 points for killing an enemy commander, but we're also going to see a couple of interesting new ways to score points in the games. We have Deep Recovery, which requires you to go pick up objectives, and then you will score more points depending on how close you get them to your deployment zone at the end of the turn. We have Build Fortifications, which requires you to go to the opponent's table half and drop an objective and then protect it, and or pick up the objectives that they drop on your table half. We have Target Sighted, which requires you to push an objective deeper into your opponent's table half, and also defend it from their models who are trying to come and move it back. And then we have Deliver Payload, which requires you to basically kick objectives at your opponent's models. And you get points if you either hit them with it or you put the objective near a bunch of their units before the end of the turn. This one seems pretty interesting to me. I'm curious how this is actually going to play when you actually get it on the table. But overall, one thing that I've noticed is that all of these objectives are going to require a lot of interacting with markers. And when you interact with the markers, you have to discard a tactics token in order to do so. So I feel like these operations are going to be very strenuous on your supply of tactics tokens, and it's going to mean that you don't have as many to spend on things like cards or stratagems. Now, I haven't played a ton of like super competitive TOS, even though I have probably 30 or 40 games of it under my belt. But I'll be curious from other people who have played a little bit more competitively how they think this compares to the previous versions of the operations that we've had. But either way, I'm super excited to see TOS getting a little bit more of a spotlight, and I'm looking forward to putting out some more videos on the subject in the near future. If you're interested in getting into the game and maybe you've never played before, then check out a couple of videos that I've done, including one about how to use the 2-player starter set if you maybe bought that from Malifaux and want to maybe give it a shot to try out TOS, as well as a breakdown of all of the factions that were existing, at least before the Sandmen came to the game. If you want to learn a little bit more about how the game actually plays, then check out my buddy Retnab, who does his own YouTube channel with some tutorials on the way that the rules work and some strategies on how to play the different factions. Retnab promised that they were going to be getting some more videos out in the near future, so I'm saying it publicly on the internet so that they have to. Ah, gotcha. Alright, well, get down in the comments below and let me know if you're excited to see some more TOS stuff coming. Are you thinking about breaking out one of your old armies or maybe getting into one of the new ones that are coming? Don't forget to like the video and make sure you are subscribed to the channel, as well as sharing this video around with some folks who you think might find it fun or interesting. Check out all the important links in the description below, including my Wyrd affiliate link. There is currently a big sale going on for Gen Con, so if you are going to be doing some shopping, then consider using that link, and it will support the channel with any purchases that you make with no extra cost to you. You can also find things like the Defective Dice merch store, where you can pick up some t-shirts and mugs and all kinds of cool things with my logo, as well as the Patreon, where you can get a whole variety of different benefits, including discounts on merch and extra entries into the giveaways that we do, as well as getting your name shouted out at the end of the videos. And on that note, I want to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Power Scoundrels, Dogmatized, Devin, and the Spilled Paint Pot. And thanks for watching.